I think the addition of the Koopalings to Super Mario Maker 2 might have just been the single most unexpected change to the game for me. I just genuinely never expected them to not only add all 7 Koopalings into the game, but also give them each different mechanics to allow for so many new and unique boss fight scenarios. With their addition, the number of bosses more than doubled, and with that the possibilities expanded even more so. Considering it's been about 8 months since I made a video about boss fights, I think it's about time we make another. So today, I want to take a look at each of these Koopalings and analyze each of their individual mechanics and how they can be used to make boss fights centered around their specific uses. Some Koopalings will get more ideas than others, and some of them just work better with Mario Maker 2's different elements, so sorry in advance, Iggy fans. Also, to just make this video a bit more unique, I'll give my opinion on each of the Koopalings' unique mechanics as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and maybe even subscribe, but with that said, let's take a look at some tips, tricks, and ideas for using the 7 Koopalings in Super Mario Maker 2. Larry is our first Koopaling, and is thus the general baseline Koopaling that the others build around. In order to defeat him, Mario will need to jump on his head 3 times. I know, groundbreaking stuff. Even more shocking is if Mario touches him, Mario will take damage. Anyways, when Larry gets hit, he'll enter into his shell and either jump around the player in the case of the Super Mario Bros., Mario 3, and Mario World themes, or just slide along the ground in the case of the new Super Mario Bros. Style. Judging by the spikes on his shell, it's not safe for Mario to jump on him while he's inside of it. However, it can be spin jumped on. Jumping isn't the only way to damage Larry though, as you can also use, oh boy, here we go, the Master Sword, Link's bombs, arrows, fireballs, super balls, the Tanuki leaf, the Cape Feather, enemies thrown from the SMB2 mushroom, stars, projectiles from Yoshi, shells, spiny shellmets, spike balls, bombs, mecha Koopas, icicles, and pows. Additionally, Larry can be crushed as well. All of the stuff we've mentioned so far applies to every single Koopaling, so I won't mention it for them in order to save us some time. Now onto Larry's specific mechanics, and there isn't really much. Every so often he'll shoot out a damaging projectile at Mario. Mario can defend against these by wearing a shellmet, but Larry will also jump around to avoid Mario, though he isn't very good at it. And yeah, that's about it for Larry. All of the other Koopalings have special gimmicks, so I guess you could say what makes Larry special is how basic he is. That means he works really well as a starter boss, so if you need a simple boss fight for your level, Larry's your guy. Now him being basic does not mean he's useless, far from it in fact. Since the other Koopalings have very niche gimmicks, Larry is more adaptable to several different setups, so let's go ahead and take a look at a few ways to use him. Toad finds himself in a room with 3 Larrys above him, however it doesn't seem like there's any way for Toad to reach them. As they shoot down their magic, Toad begins to realize this might just be the end. All of the experiences he's had, all of the places he's gone, all the people he's loved, this is what it's all led to. Toad just sits there helplessly, weeping to himself, knowing that this is going to be the last thing he ever did. Anyways, Mario is smart and decided to let Toad go in before him, so now he knows what he needs to do. But first, it's important that he grabs his shellmet. See, Mario noticed that nothing actually hit Toad, rather the floor below him fell apart when Larry's magic went past him. So with this new knowledge, Mario fights back against the magic, destroying each shot with his shellmet until eventually a P-switch activates, crushing the Larrys and letting him escape. So what's going on here? Well, there's a feature about Larry's magic that I haven't really shared with you all yet. In the new Super Mario Bros. Game style, his magic will act as a fire attack, which can melt frozen coins. In the other 3 styles, these are just pure magic, meaning they aren't hot enough to melt the coins, so this only works in New Soup. Using this special property, we have a line of frozen coins at the bottom of the screen, and each of them has a muncher on top. If any of the coins get hit, then these munchers will fall into the conveyor belt, activating an on-off switch. This would then erase the floor below the player, eventually killing them. The rest of the setup is pretty simple, just have a room above with Larry's and a P-switch on a track that will activate to end the room. What I like about this is just how easy it is to adjust its difficulty. Simply by adding or removing Larry's, you can make this room much more or less intense. Now I did use Larry for this example, however both Iggy and Ludwig work as well. There are a lot of ways to customize this room, so just figure out what works best for your level. I would also suggest putting this in a level based around using shellmet so it's more obvious what the player has to do, though this can still work in other contexts. Mario has been dropped into a small cave area. Larry is just on the other side, however there's no way for Mario to reach him. Larry doesn't have a problem with that though, since he can just keep shooting his magic through the walls. While avoiding the attacks, Mario finally gets off the pipe he was standing on and notices that there are actually Buzzy Beetles inside. While Mario can't go through the bumpers, Shell certainly can. Larry also foolishly jumps every so often, so with some lucky timing, Mario is able to hit him. Once Larry gets out of his shell, it's time to do this 2 more times. Mario being the god gamer that he is, he's able to do it with very little trouble and survive the room. Now there isn't too much to explain about this mechanically, as everything on screen is pretty much what you get. Larry's hitbox just barely peaks up above the semi-solid when he jumps, which allows him to actually get hit by the shells. Make sure to put a one-way over top of him, as he'll be able to jump out when he gets in his shell if you don't. Now one thing I really like about this room is how Larry jumps. See, his jumps aren't actually that random, as he'll follow a pattern depending on how much damage he's taken. If he hasn't been hit yet, he'll shoot out one projectile then jump. After leaving his shell the first time, he'll shoot out 2 projectiles before jumping. And when he's on his last hit, he'll shoot 3 before jumping. Not only is this a predictable pattern, making this boss about timing rather than guessing, but that makes this boss get harder as it goes. It can get quite difficult to avoid 3 shots of magic in the small room, so I actually think this concept turned out way better than I expected it to. This can also work with most of the other Koopalings, but I found that Larry easily worked the best out of the group due to his simple to understand patterns. For our final Larry idea, I wanted to slow down a bit and talk about his more basic uses and some general arena setups. Just simply fighting the boss normally has its place in levels, so let's talk about some arena types that work well with Larry. If you're using him, you're likely trying to set up an easier boss to defeat since he's the easiest Koopaling. That means a simple flat arena could work, but personally I like to lean into his jumping mechanics, so placing semi-solid platforms around the arena for him to jump onto would take better advantage of his abilities. Larry's AI is also very smart, so he won't be jumping into the void or lava, so you could feel free to have the edges of your arena filled with nothing. Additionally, I made a small setup using his smart AI. Basically, Mario has to ride on this raft made of bill blasters back and forth to hit Larry as he shoots at Mario. In my testing, Larry has never once jumped into the lava, meaning the setup should work perfectly. This also eliminates the sort of cheese you can do against most bosses, where you jump on them before they even get a chance to attack. The burners will block Mario from trying again right away, which makes him retreat back to the raft. Oh yeah, one more thing I wanted to mention is that if Larry has nowhere to jump, he just won't, which I find kind of funny. He also talks to himself or something. I don't know what it's about though. But that's it for our main man Larry. While he is basic, he's still able to work with a ton of setups due to this simplicity. Alright, 1 down, 6 to go. I'm going to go in order that they're sorted on the wheel, which means Iggy is up next. Oh, poor Iggy. You know, I like this guy a lot, but somehow he always gets sort of messed up in every game he's in. He got easily the lamest mechanics of all the Koopalings. He acts the exact same as Larry, however sometimes he'll move back and forth instead of jumping. I excuse Larry for being simple because it makes sense to have at least one of them be that way, but having 2 relatively simple ones seems kind of pointless. If it were up to me, I think it would have been really nice if he could run up walls and ceilings like he could in his New Super Mario Bros. U boss fight. The spike top enemy can already do this, so I imagine it wouldn't be too hard to add in. Maybe they could have even kept the back and forth movement if there weren't any nearby walls to attach to. I don't know, it just would have been nice to see something a bit more creative. Iggy is much harder than Larry though. If we were to put the 7 Koopalings in a basic room with no obstacles beside them, Iggy would probably be the single hardest one. The way he's able to move around unpredictably makes jumping on him genuinely pretty difficult, even for experienced players. That means if you want to just have a simple 1v1 against him, you really don't need to make a special room for it to be challenging. Having a perfectly flat plane is really all you're going to be able to get from this guy. On the plus side, he could be used in the lava raft room I mentioned before to make it more difficult, but as it stands, there really aren't many situations where Iggy can be used that Larry wouldn't be better. I was able to come up with one that I actually really liked though, so let's take a look at that. Mario enters into a room with, shockingly, no immediate danger. Mario notices Iggy at the top, but he doesn't seem to be doing much more than shooting down his spells. That is until he starts to move to the left and actually launches down a mole. Now it's clear what's going to happen. Iggy is going to start shooting down either an army of moles or chain chomps towards Mario, and he'll have to survive until something defeats Iggy for him. Mario is able to narrowly avoid all of the enemies and spells flying his way, spin jumping over the chain chomps and onto the moles. Eventually, after a lot of decisions from Iggy, the timer finally expires, killing him and dropping down the stars from the ceiling so that Mario is able to escape. Let's take a look to see how this was done. The primary mechanism is located up here with Iggy's selection chamber. This small room allows him to go to either the left or right. Due to RNG deciding his movement pattern, it makes his boss fight give you a different selection of enemies each time you play. It also makes it more difficult to predict where to be and how to avoid the enemy's attacks. There's nowhere that you can stand to be perfectly safe, because every single time there's something that can be attacking you. Depending on which side he chooses, he'll activate that side's note block, bouncing him up onto the spring and resetting his position. As for the enemies he dispenses, we have red pipes on both sides shooting out different enemies that get trapped under that side's note block. Make sure to include a one-way here so that the note block doesn't miss the enemy. Once trapped, they're placed on top of a seesaw. Since these platforms are thinner than others, the enemies will actually get pushed through them by the note block, which is what allows this whole thing to work. Blue lifts can also work as well. Oh yeah, and make sure you have another one way to prevent soft locks. The enemies that Iggy shoots out don't have to be moles or chain chomps, by the way, I just thought they worked best. Pretty much anything that gets dispensed multiple times from pipes and can move forward into the hole work here. I like the moles though because if Iggy doesn't choose them for a while, they'll actually build up into the spot and seem to duplicate when released. The last thing about this room is of course the timer, which just simply has a P-switch right a track onto the muncher at the top. P-switch blocks are placed in Iggy's room so that he'll die when it goes off. I also gave the players stars because it might be difficult to even get in the door after the long battle. That's pretty much everything for this room. This is probably one of my favorites in this video. I just had to give Iggy some respect since the devs clearly did not. Let's move on from this poor guy. Alright, Wendy has our first really unique mechanic, though I would still say it's a bit disappointing. Like Larry, she'll jump around and shoot magic, however her magic is a little different. This comes in the form of a ring that will bounce off of every surface, including floors, ceilings, and walls. Conceptually, I like this mechanic. It provides a unique projectile that's only really similar to the super balls that the player throws. Unfortunately, these rings don't interact with anything. They're able to damage the player, of course, but aside from that, they don't meaningfully interact with anything else, at least from what I could find. They don't act as fire, they can't hit other enemies, heck they can't even activate stuff like note blocks or on-off switches. This is super disappointing. It severely limits how useful these could have been by just simply making them hitboxes. If I were to change these, I'd at minimum let them act as fire. That way they would be able to light bombs or melt frozen coins, but as it is now, they aren't really useful for that much. She works really well as a basic boss fight though. When making an arena for her, you're going to want to make sure you optimize it around her rings. The smaller you make the arena, the harder it'll be to avoid them, so adjusting the arena size would be an easy way to increase or decrease difficulty. Maybe making the floor slippery or making it on conveyor belts could help as well. As for special ideas for her, I was sadly only able to come up with one, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. Mario enters into a tight tunnel, face to face with Wendy. Lucky for him, Wendy isn't that smart, so she marked the exit with an arrow sign. She begins to shoot her rings, but the tunnel is too small for Mario to jump over them. Luckily, there are places for Mario to go under, and with some carefully placed jumps, Mario is able to move on to the next section. With some carefully placed jumps and another on-off switch toggle, Mario is able to move on to the next section. There's only one way for him to go. It'll be tight, but with perfect timing, he's able to just barely squeeze through. Now all that's left is a 1v1 with the real Wendy, because I got too lazy to expand this concept further. Jumping between her smaller rings, Mario successfully escapes Wendy's tunnels. Unlike the last idea for Iggy, there really isn't too much to explain in this one. It all comes down to the Wendy ring launchers. I used a big Wendy since her rings are obviously bigger, and I also stacked her on top of a muncher. That way she wouldn't move around this area and also make her shots much more consistent. Even though this room is exactly big enough to spawn her in, she's actually smaller than her maker hitbox. Larry, Iggy in all styles except New Soup, Wendy, and Lemmy are all actually only 1 block tall and wide, but the maker's hitbox is 2x2 tiles. I'm not entirely sure why this is done, but this is kind of annoying because it makes them a little too easy to spawn block. I really wish their sizes were much more accurate as it would make them much easier to work with. Anyways, back to the main idea. These one-ways are used so that her rings shoot out lower down, as without them they'd shoot upwards and get stuck in this area for a while. Finally, bumpers are used to block Mario from entering while allowing the rings to leave. This concept is very simple, but sadly there aren't any other good ways to use these rings in levels without them being able to interact with other things. Maybe there's something I missed, but as it is now, this is what Wendy's gonna get. Lemmy is our first one with a really strong gimmick. Upon spawning in, he'll jump onto a ball and then proceed to shoot out bouncy balls towards the player. These projectiles are the most unique of the Koopalings, as instead of damaging Mario, they'll just bounce him around. The way this interacts with the player makes it one of the most helpful items from any of the Koopalings, allowing for several unique scenarios that could not have been done without it. In fact, the only thing I don't like about this is the fact that it's stuck to Lemmy. If we could place these balls inside of pipes or bill blasters, then they would become even more useful. I'll take what we can get right now though, because this is definitely a solid start. Since these can't damage Mario, if you're designing an arena for a Lemmy fight, you're going to want to make sure the platform you fight on has edges that Mario can fall into. If there's no void to fall into, then Lemmy is a complete joke and probably the easiest boss by a mile. The smaller the platform, the less room you'll have to work with, so adjust the length of the platform based on how hard you want the boss fight to be. A simple boss fight is just the tip of the iceberg of what Lemmy can do, so let's go ahead and take a look at a few other ways to use him. Okay, I'm going to be totally honest. I stole the next two from my boss fight ranking video. I know, before you drop a dislike over my shameless reuse of ideas, Yeah, here's the funny video of me smashing the Peepa again. Mario is dropped into a room with two very big Lemmys at his side. The platform Mario is standing on is pretty small, meaning he's going to have to really do his best to avoid getting pushed around by these guys. Due to their enlarged size, Mario has even less room to work with, just barely squeezing through the obstacles until the timer runs out and he's able to escape. I'm reusing this from the old video because I think this shows off perfectly how to avoid these, so this video would sort of feel incomplete otherwise. Lemmy's AI is smart, so you won't have to worry about them just rolling off the platform. On-off blocks are placed behind them so that when the timer runs out, they'll be defeated. I haven't mentioned this yet, but it does apply to every single Koopaling. Once they're defeated, their magic will actually disappear along with them. This is super helpful in preventing deaths after timer expirations. Anyways, this timer is just simply a muncher on a track that will crush tuba bombs and then activate the on-off switch. One last thing, make sure to include these tracks at the bottom to catch the muncher after. We really don't want to send Luigi to the hospital again. Now, Lemmy is also our first Koopaling that I think works really well outside of boss room scenarios. These examples would have been a bit easier had we just been able to place down the spells, but let's work with what we have. Due to their unique bouncing property, the spells make excellent obstacles for levels that are in tight spaces. Forcing Mario to avoid these on top of other enemies can provide some pretty good challenges. Additionally, the balls can actually be used to help Mario, since he can jump off of them and get a lot of height. I think the best use for this would be collecting a secret of some kind. In order to set up these ball dispensers, you just have to create something like this. Lemmy won't actually try to escape from here, so all you have to do is place a one-way so that Mario won't be able to reach him. Keep in mind though, levels using this concept are likely to be very short. You can sadly only place 7 Lemmys per sub area, so make sure to use them effectively. I also designed a small, puzzle around using Lemmy's ball spell. I'm not a puzzle designer, so really this is just a laid out order of tasks, but hopefully you all get where I'm coming from. I like that the balls basically act as springs that can't be carried. They're not perfectly one-to-one of course, but they can be used that way if you want to. Overall, there are a ton of ways to customize something like this. And finally, we're over halfway through the Koopalings. You know, I've always been a pretty big fan of Roy, but man is his gimmick annoying. Like Larry, he'll move around and occasionally shoot out magic. However, every once in a while, he'll bury himself into the ground and reappear somewhere completely different, breaking through either some ground or the ceiling. Now, this gimmick is a good idea, it certainly makes him pretty unique unlike Iggy, however, this is a pain to deal with. He's able to reappear anywhere, meaning that if you aren't careful, he might just appear somewhere you don't want him to. That's why you have to always ensure he cannot be loaded in before he's supposed to. This is very important for traditional levels, as if the player spawns him in too early, he'll dig right to them. It doesn't matter if the platforms aren't connected, I guess he's able to move through the 4th dimension or something. Fighting the guy can be quite annoying to do as well. He's pretty much guaranteed to dig at least once per hit, meaning that he'll easily take the most time to defeat out of any of the Koopalings. I also never liked how he becomes completely intangible once he starts digging. It always looks really weird. Since he is able to move between disconnected land masses, you can make some pretty interesting arenas for even just a basic fight against him. Take full advantage of him moving from place to place by having several different platforms for Mario and Roy to go between. Again, just make sure the player can't spawn him in too early. Now, coming up with an idea for this guy was really hard. I'd say he was the hardest out of any Koopaling in this video. It was just way too difficult to contain him because he can resurface on pretty much every single surface in the game. Hard blocks, bricks, clouds, semi-solids, on-off switches, heck even POWs he can surface from. Luckily though, there is one exception. One solid surface that Roy cannot come up from. That surface is sideways springs. If you want to work with Roy for any sort of complex boss fight, using sideways springs is a must. Sideways springs are also affected by gravity, which is what gave me the idea for this next room. Mario and his Fire Yoshi enter in. Right away, Mario notices that the ground he's standing on isn't very safe. One hit of a P-switch and the floor below him will fall. It's safe to assume that those Galoombas are likely the ones to do just that. While doing all that thinking, Roy escaped his small hole in the middle and dug above one of the Galoomba chambers. Remembering Iggy's room from earlier, he knows that the Galoombas are going to fall the moment Roy jumps on that note block. With perfect precision, Mario commands his Yoshi to shoot a fireball out and defeat the Galoomba. This is pretty difficult to time, but luckily, Mario is able to time them perfectly while dodging all of Roy's magic. Mario has to do this quite a few times, but after a few seconds, the room's timer finally expires, making the floor below him safe from gravity and giving him a key in the process. So what all is going on here? Well, a lot of this is actually pretty similar to Iggy's room. We see those same enemy dispensers, however they've been slightly updated. Since only big Galoombas can activate a P-switch, this area has been expanded to accommodate their new size. Roy doesn't move the same way Iggy does though, so the rooms are actually completely separated this time around, being the only 2 places he can travel to. Don't ask me why he isn't able to travel back into the middle section, I literally have no idea why he works like that. I believe it's because it isn't wide enough, so make sure the space above the note blocks are at least 4 blocks wide. I also suggest putting a semi-solid over the note blocks like this to prevent him from hitting it multiple times. Also again, don't ask me why he never appears on the semi-solid, it just works. Finally, you need to put a one-way here in the Goomba chambers, as if you don't, Roy will somehow be able to spawn in there. I seriously have no idea how his mechanics work. From there, have bumpers block Mario from the P-switches that the Goombas will fall onto. For the platform that the player will stand on, just make it all be sideways springs on top of P-switch blocks. Finally, the timer is the classic muncher on a track to a Bob-omb that hits an on-off switch. Gotta work on that name. Oh yeah, also make sure the Bob-omb can't be hit by Yoshi, as if it can, well then you can kinda just cheese this entire room. I suggest placing dotted line blocks behind the springs here to make sure that the player can't die once the challenge is complete. Now that covers everything within the room itself, however there's one really important thing that I want to talk about here. A room like this can be somewhat confusing, as it isn't immediately obvious what you have to do, especially with how strict the timing is. If you want to use something like this to end off one of your levels, make sure the concept is introduced sometime beforehand. For example, you can have a setup like this, where you have to shoot the Goomba from midair to collect the key in the process. Something like that, which introduces the concept in a safe place, will make this significantly less confusing and more fun, so just keep that in mind. Morton is the second to last Koopaling, and luckily his gimmick is also a pretty good one. Like Larry once again, he'll shoot out a projectile before doing his special move, which in this case is a giant leap into the air followed by a ground pound. Not only will Mario take damage if he gets hit by this, but the ground pound will also cast out 2 fireballs to each side of him that will ride across the floor, walls, and ceilings. The ground pound will also stun anyone that's on the ground when it happens, making Morton one of the more difficult Koopalings to defeat. With so many different elements, Morton is also quite useful for contraptions. But hold on, let's slow down a bit, as we still have to talk about how a general Morton arena would be set up. Due to many of his attacks being ground-based, I think keeping the arena on one central platform would be best. I also think making the ground of the arena sort of complex would also go well with Morton's gimmick. Having, say, pipes at different heights sort of like this will make the fire trickier to dodge, and thus making this boss fight more difficult. I'd say pretty much any arena that doesn't have a large pit in the middle should work though, just force the player to be on the ground for a large portion of the fight. Now let's look at some good ways to use Morton's fire attacks. Alright, so what I was going to do for this segment was reuse my boss fight from the last Mario Maker video about Bill Blasters. Basically, Mario just has to time his ground pound on a seesaw to launch the fire and kill Morton. I decided against going into more depth here because this video is much longer than I expected. So if you want to see this and a bunch of other good uses for Bill Blasters, click the card on screen. Okay, back to this video. Just like Lemmy, Morton works really well as just a simple obstacle in a traditional course. He has 3 main things to worry about: his spells, fire, and ground pound stun. That means he works best in situations where Mario doesn't have a lot of room and also has to carefully time when to go about doing a challenge. For example, here Mario has to run over this conveyor that's beneath burners. The cycle starts on the fire mode, meaning Morton will have enough time to send out an attack or 2. Mario then has to carefully weave between the spells and fire without getting stunned, because that'd keep him in place long enough for the burners to come back. You could also use the fire in a situation like this, where Mario has to try to avoid a firebar and lava on top of the Morton fire. Basically, having a section where you have to be patient is the best time to use Morton, as it gives plenty of time for him to attack. You can also use him as a body block that you have to run under, or just a general way to make platforming across a gap with conveyors more difficult with his stun. There are a lot of possibilities, so I suggest looking into them. Once again though, you can only have up to 7 per sub area, so use each Morton effectively. Hey, wait a minute. Nope, stop talking, just ignore that. Speaking of that old video that I just spontaneously remembered, I really like this old setup that I did. It's sort of similar to the Lemmy one I showed earlier in that there are 2 big enemies on the side of Mario that he can't reach. If their fire doesn't have any wall to go down, like when it reaches the edge of a semi-solid, it will actually float in midair across the void until it reaches something. This lets us create an incredibly chaotic survival room where Mario has to do his best to avoid getting killed by all of the projectiles Morton is throwing out. Now that I'm thinking about it, both of these ideas were a lot like Lemmy, huh? Guess you could say Morton is just Lemmy, but you know, a bit more deadly. And that leaves us with one, Ludwig. He's probably my personal favorite Koopaling, not gameplay-wise, but as a character. That's not to say his gameplay is bad though, far from it in fact. Instead of shooting out 1 spell, he'll fire out 3 at once. If he's on his last hit, that'll change to 5. Ludwig's jump is also a lot different from Larry's, where he'll stay in the air much longer and move around much more. Compared to Morton or Lemmy, this is a pretty simple gimmick. However, I still really like it as it makes Ludwig a decent challenge to defeat. His jumps allow him to go between several platforms at once, so you can have the fight take place over several platforms, or you can just do one that you have to move around to avoid a small range. is. He's definitely next to Iggy in terms of difficulty, so he's the best to use if you have, say, a tricky traditional castle. Now, the sheer number of projectiles he spits out and the pattern that they fly in is super unique and allows for a ton of different possibilities, so let's take a look at one. This is probably the single most simple idea in this video, but Mario is dropped onto a bridge with 4 Ludwigs hiding within the walls. Without much time to think, Mario has to weave in and out of Ludwig's projectiles carefully. Lucky for him, the hitboxes are decently small, but with 12 rings getting fired out at once, it can be somewhat tricky to move between them. After about 4 rounds, an on-off switch is finally activated off-screen, killing the Ludwigs and allowing Mario to leave. There's really not much happening here. Each of the Ludwigs are on tracks which keep them from jumping and allow them to be in the walls. Since the rings don't collide with surfaces, they're able to phase straight through them towards the player. The timer is, shocker, that. Since the Ludwigs are on tracks though, we can't crush them with dotted line blocks like we normally would. So instead, bombs are placed around them that will explode once the switch is hit. Normally, this blast wouldn't be enough to kill them, but since getting hit will take a boss off of a track, Ludwig would then go into the wall and then get crushed that way. This also eliminates the leftover rings, which is very helpful. Yes, this is simple, but I personally really enjoy doing this one in particular, especially since it'll be different every time you try it. I think Ludwig's best use is just adding a bit more tension in with his magic rings. He doesn't even need to be the focus of the fight, he just does a good job of keeping the player on their toes while they have to do something else. Just as a quick example, in my last level I had the player use their spiny shellmet to defeat a Pokey at the top of the room. Since the Pokey obviously can't fight back though, 2 Ludwigs were added to the side of the room, and I think that goes a long way in making the fight more engaging. If you feel that your boss room or final challenge doesn't have a high enough difficulty, experiment a bit with throwing a Ludwig or 2 in there, I think it could help a lot. But anyways, that's it for this video. Do you all think I was being too harsh on Wendy Koopa? Let me know in the comments. I'll be honest, I had no idea how long this was going to be when I started, but I think most of the ideas here turned out really well. If you enjoyed them, make sure to leave a like and maybe even subscribe to the channel. Also, I haven't really asked you all for this before, but if you want, leave a comment about a specific item for future tips and tricks videos. I think it would be really fun to try an item that's rarely used at all, so get as obscure as you all want to. But anyways, Rybones for Smash, and I'll see you guys next time.